Thank you very much, Ekaterina, for this very generous introduction. Also, thank you very much, Jan, as well as the organizing team, for inviting me here. It's a great honor for me to deliver this lecture. It's also daunting to do so among so many colleagues, so many great scholars. It's also slightly daunting because, as Ekaterina already mentioned, I tend to work very ethnographically, and what I will attempt to do here is something slightly more comparatively. And as a sociologist, George Steinmetz has written, all comparisons, even if comparison is unavoidable sometimes or often, all comparisons are odious. They stink. So we'll see where we get in this lecture. I will start ethnographically, nevertheless, not this one. Over here, yes. So to start, I would like to take you back 26 years, when in the year 2000, Georgia was celebrating 2,000 years of Christianity and 3,000 years of Georgian statehood. The place of action was Upper Adjara, a region that at the time was overwhelmingly Muslim, but which the Georgian Orthodox Church imagined to be the place where Saint Andrew, Jesus' first apostle, had started the Christianization of Georgia. On May 12th, Bishop Dimitri was leading a pilgrimage trip accompanied by clergy, congregants, and scholars from Batumi to a site near the village of Didachara, where Saint Andrew was imagined to have built the first church in Georgia. Rituals were performed, participants were blessed, speeches were made, and a commemorative stone was placed on this declared holy site. The bishop and his entourage were welcomed by local notables and invited to a grand dinner after they returned from the pilgrimage site. But while welcomed, the event did not go entirely uncontested. During the dinner, some of the villagers spoke up, questioning the emphasis on deep Christian history, because they had been Muslim for many generations. The challenges remained rather muted, however, drowned out by the force of historical discourse, which emphasized that Georgian culture is Christian, and that time had come for people in Adjara to return to their native religion. Notwithstanding the ostensible post-socialist religious freedom, which would suggest an even playing field between Islam and Christianity, the asymmetry of the encounter was palpable. Just as striking was the force of imagination, which, concretized in a pilgrimage and materialized in artifacts, recast this Muslim region as a lost Christian territory that was now on the verge of being reincorporated into a national religious collective. This political religious space, overdetermined with affective meaning, had a certain texture and shape. A pilgrimage in the present mobilized the past to chart the future, actively reshaping space in the process. It is about such shapings that I wish to talk to you today. I will return to this vignette and present additional ethnographic examples, but first I would like to discuss the following. Why would forms, shapes, and contours matter in studying spaces? As this conference has demonstrated already abundantly, the study of Soviet and post-Soviet spaces is alive and well. Contributions have covered numerous topics and deployed a range of perspectives to analyze the relation between space and human existence in all its dimensions. Space, as the term itself already suggests, is expansive. One of tomorrow's panels will even take us to outer space, while yesterday a panel explored the temporal spaces of no longer and not yet, and many others have analyzed geographic, linguistic, and religious spaces. Space is difficult to define, maybe impossible to define. It is multidimensional. And the difficulty, I think, is summed up by Doreen Massey's image, which simply says, "This is not space." In other words, space is not to be reduced to a two-dimensional map. It is very much alive. For me, the study of space has always been tied up with a range of influential works. Michel de Certeau, whose The Practice of Everyday Life, 1980, deployed the metaphor of reading to capture how through ordinary practices and tactics people appropriate and live in spatial structures, such as the urban grid. Henri Lefebvre's The Production of Space, 1974, which emphasized how space is constructed through the interplay between practice and perception. Nigel Thrift's 1996 Spatial Formations, which studies the interconnections between places, people and things to highlight also sensation, such as the centrality of smell and taste in the spice trade. And the already mentioned For Space, 2005 by Doreen Massey, which foregrounds the dynamics of space, turning space, as it were, in a verb. She suggests we should be talking about spacing rather than just space. And as such, they are in line with numerous other works that focus on placemaking, following feminist, decolonial, and other critical approaches that attempt to reclaim places from the dominant powers that attempt to define them, while simultaneously showing how space is always pregnant with the residues of dominant power. Thinking of spaces is clearly productive. It allows us to conceptualize how structural and agentive forces come together, how spatial and temporal dimensions intersect, and to understand the political, economic, the affective and imaginative dimensions of the world. The pilgrimage to the Dashara, with which I started, already indicated as much, in that this was about the intersection of imaginaries and social realities, about the confluence of religious and cultural discourses, and about how the temporal and the spatial interact. Nevertheless, I want to use this paper to push in a slightly different direction. That is, while taking on board the lessons about the complexity of how spaces are constituted, I want to explore if we can identify broader spatial patterns and dynamics, and see how these might illuminate social, political, cultural, and religious phenomena, with a focus on religious phenomena. It is this that my title, Spatial Morphology, refers to. It's an attempt to think about the shapes, the forms, and figurations that characterize space. It looks at how shapings occur in the imagination, but then also how this resonates in actualities playing out on the ground, and how in the process space is reconfigured in its multiple dimensions. The specific spatial shapes that I'm interested in are the ones that emerge and are produced in encounters of truth. This is related to my new European Research Council project titled Trading Truth in the South Caucasus, Missions, Mediations and Extractions, which has actually only started a few months ago. It is a large project that aims to document and theorize how truth crosses lines of difference, and the roles played by bringers of truth, by mediators of truth, and by extractors of truth. In this lecture, I focus on bringers of truth, on missions and missionaries who cross lines of cultural and religious difference to establish patterns of communication that allow the transmission of these truths. And as we saw in the pilgrimage to the Achara, there may well be a special shape to such encounters, a shape whose contours exist in the imagination, but are pressed onto social and material realities with varying outcomes. These are the issues I wish to address, and to do so I will first take a few steps back to discuss morphology and topology. A few years ago I published a paper that I wanted to have had the term topological in the title, but ultimately the journal's editor convinced me to take out the word, as it would narrow the paper's potential readership. Speaking of topological morphology would fare even worse, seemingly of interest only to specialists working with that terminology. And yet at the heart of it, the twofold analytical shift that I'm proposing is not in the least technical, as I hope to briefly illustrate. The first shift takes us to discussions of topology as initially developed by actor network theorists. To highlight its distinctiveness, I find it useful to contrast it with topography, which is literally about describing places in the sense of mapping spatial elements and attributes. Topology, by contrast, uses a relational logic that foregrounds how dimensions of space, temporal, affective, organizational, physical, are interconnected. Perhaps this merely captures what many of us are doing anyway. So why even highlight the term on topology? One reason could be that topology immediately draws attention to the shaping of space. A useful suggestion to this effect is by Scott Lash, when he writes that topological objects, through their own energetics, drive their own space and time. This dynamical shaping is constituted by the affective and relational dimensions of the figuration itself, in which, quote, power relationships are not so much positioned in space or extended across it, as that they compose the spaces of which they are a part. Add-in here. In other words, the interlocking of relationships gives space a certain coherence, direction, and shape. This last point already indicates that a topological approach can be productively connected to a morphological one. Here we need to tread slightly carefully, because social morphology is a term that Emile Durkheim used already more than a century ago. For him, social morphology was about studying how human populations are distributed and organized across space, varying in density, concentration, and avenues of communication, all of which play a preponderant role in collective life. What he wrote is all fine, but nevertheless his two-dimensional social morphology hardly addressed relationships, and therefore his mapping of societal shapes is not really fit for purpose here. A potentially better starting point is to simply reflect on the very human tendency to think in shapes and forms, whether explicitly or implicitly. We see this with a range of concepts that have spatial implications. For example, when people speak of a market economy, they implicitly think of a space as having a degree of openness, a market where buyers and sellers meet to make transactions. By contrast, when terms like elites, monopoly, or oligarchy are used, the implication is that said social space is relatively closed, characterized by obstacles that separate them, the powerful, from the rest. But we can also think of more concrete forms. Anthropologist Martin Holbraat implicitly suggested that we are all morphologists, and he makes this point with reference to COVID, when everyone started thinking in terms of social distancing, lockdowns, confinements, bubbles, and tiers. A time when we were made aware also of how shapes of social relations impacted the distribution of viral contagion and became the object of collective action. Quote from Holbraat. This latter point is crucial. It is not just that we can observe shapes, but that those shapes trigger or invite action. And because of this, societal shaping may attain its own semi-autonomic dynamic. It is this that the combination between morphology and topology tries to address. I could make the same point about implicit morphology also in relation to the Caucasus and to Central Asia, or its studies, as it were. André Gunder Frank, for example, an author better known, in fact, for his theory of the development of underdevelopment, observed that Central Asia often appears in representations as a sort of black hole in the middle of the world, seen by historians and representatives of the surrounding Chinese, Persian, and Russian civilizations as a dark tabula rasa on which itinerant monks, mullahs, and artists from these allegedly civilized areas left their mark. Quote from him. It is a stereotype, of course, but one which he interestingly turns around, showing how this image also contributed to the region, often having been one of turmoil, innovation, and connection. Or if we turn to the Caucasus, then I think we're all familiar with works that present the region as a crossroads between civilizations. The implicit idea here is that the structural interlocking of influences, of its in-between position, can explain what has happened in the Caucasus. There's a risk, of course, for such representations to degenerate into stereotype and cliché, and they often do. But that's no reason to abandon it entirely. In very recent work, some of which is still unpublished, Stanford's anthropologist Serkan Yolacan, for example, uses this perspective to show how inter-imperial influence operates. He does this by tracing and following practices, objects, and people as they move between empires or as they draw influences from them. The idea is that the form, in this case the crossroads, generates a particular kind of sensibility, influencing ways of being in and engaging with the world. While I'm intrigued by morphological statements that take as their object entire regions, and while I admire those who engage with them in creative and thought-provoking ways, I'm personally more at ease with addressing them at a more modest scale, at a scale where I can study human action and interaction. And it is with this in mind that I will return to the more empirical part of the lecture, which addresses the work of professional border crossers, namely of missionaries. My ethnographic fieldwork has primarily focused on religious missionaries, Orthodox Christian, Evangelical Pentecostal, Tablighi Islam, but it's useful to see them as part of a broader class of actors and movements that also includes secular missions, such as those carried out by development workers and political ideologues, be they Soviet anti-religious activists or colonial modernizers. They share, I would suggest, at least three features. They have an expansionist drive, see themselves as bringers of truth, and use communication as a means of transformation. In fact, the commonalities are well captured by the term civilizing missions, mission civilisatrice, and the elitist attitude that bespeaks it. I'm making this brief comparison because the similarities also extend to the ways in which religious and secular missionaries perceive the terrain in which they operate and that they aim to reshape. To make this visible, it's useful to look at one of the concepts that is sometimes used to characterize the terrain in which they operate. The concept that I have in mind is that of the frontier. It's a powerful image because, or concept, because the frontier combines the projection of superiority with a combination of danger and desire associated with expansion. It's also a slightly difficult term because it's not easy to translate, actually. So kind of translating it to Granica wouldn't do the trick, as it were. Even translating frontier to Spanish frontera wouldn't do the trick either. But anyway, we're stuck with English here, and we have some definitions to guide us through. So here, the similarities between political and religious views is striking, as can be seen by starting with the following definition of a political geographer, Christophe. He writes, historically speaking, the frontier was not the end, the tail, but rather the beginning, the forehead. It was the spearhead of light and knowledge, expanding into the realm of darkness and the unknown. Pioneer settlements of a forward-moving culture bent on occupying the whole area. You can see kind of the elitist flavor dripping from it. What I find remarkable is that this definition of the political frontier is identical, at least in spirit, to how the frontier is discussed in some religious corners, such as by a prominent North American evangelical missionary and editor of the International Journal of Frontier Missions. He writes, the frontier represents that beyond which we must go, yet beyond which we may not be able to see clearly. The frontier is related to the glorification of God in all the nations of the world, to open their eyes, to turn them from darkness to the light, and from the power of Satan to God. And citation of the biblical book Acts there. In evangelical discourse, the frontier refers to the effort of spreading the good news of the gospel to those who have not heard it yet. It is about reaching the unreached, with special attention recently to the Muslim world. The term frontier is used less by the other two groups that I will consider, Tablighi Muslims and Orthodox Christians. But this is partly the kind of a linguistic artifact. As I already mentioned, the term doesn't necessarily easily translate. The larger point is that whether or not the same term is used, the same elements can be found across the movements. A duty of spreading the truth beyond one's own community, something that is imagined as bringing light to darkness. The term frontier is also useful for my purposes because it links directly to my observations about topological morphology, that is, of the relational shapes and shapings of space. This can be seen in even one of the earlier conceptualizations of the frontier, in Frederick Jackson Turner's influential frontier thesis, which theorized how civilizations expand, in his case, in relation to the American West, leading him to suggest that the frontier was not just that which lies at the margins, but a figuration with its own dynamic, spurred on by the possibilities provided by the receding horizon of the wilderness. For him, the frontier was like the outer edge of the wave. By the way, the book is highly problematic, but the kind of the little analytical element that I nevertheless find useful when he talks about the frontier as the outer edge of the wave as a series of waves. This image of the wave powerfully invokes the relational and affective dimensions that constitute the space-time of the frontier, of a figuration that builds up, extends its reach, to then release its energy. I hope to have demonstrated, even if only briefly, that there are similarities between missionary movements in terms of what drives missions and how they perceive the terrain in which they operate. But we also need to pay attention to some very real differences, which are partly due to the different settings in which they operate, and partly due to their different theologies and forms of organization. If we would have to summarize it very briefly, then we would have to the following, perhaps. Orthodox Christian missions are motivated by a logic of ecclesiastical integrity and historical continuity. Missionary activities were not randomly expansive, but rather geared towards incorporating a lost part of the imagined larger Orthodox community, at least in Ajara. That was the case. Evangelical Pentecostal Christianity holds an unreservedly expansionist logic centered on reaching the unreached, which accepts that not all souls are destined to be saved, and accepts collateral damage as an unavoidable part of the larger cosmic struggle. The Tablighi Jamaat is centered on the notion of invitation, dawat, inviting others to the faith, and has turned this into a method of religious invigoration of its own community. In other words, these movements vary in how they see the world, with different emphases on either the individual or the collective, as also reflected in their theologies of salvation. Differences in terms of pursuing either continuity or radical change, and also differences in how they relate faith to culture. This has consequences for how actual missionaries' encounters unfold, which brings me to the next section. When imagination hits the ground. Let me elaborate, even if only briefly, on the metaphor of the wave. People who regularly watch the sea as it advances and retreats, such as surfers, I'm not one myself. If there are specialists, they can correct me on what I have to say next. But they have a very rich vocabulary to discuss the shape, movement, and predictability of waves. They talk about the kinetic energy of waves as dependent on the tides, the wind, and on time intervals. This influences the height and shape of waves very, very profoundly. But even more important is the underground that the waves encounter. Rocky or sandy, gently sloped or steep, closing into a bay or curving around a shoreline. Together, this results into close-out waves, standing waves, waves that gently roll into the shore, hollow waves, waves that retreat or that crash into the shore. We don't need to hold on tightly to the metaphor to appreciate that similar considerations are relevant in the case of missionary work. And like surfers, missionaries appear to be aware of these different shapes, and they actively engage with it. So let me present what this has amounted to among the three movements that I studied. So we first go to Kyrgyzstan, where evangelical Pentecostal Christianity has made significant inroads since the mid-1990s. This advance has been foreign-driven, with North American missionaries being dominant, but it also built on pre-existing evangelical and Pentecostal churches, and in the years since, the entire missionary effort has become increasingly indigenized. Their missionization logic is based on, or at least partly on, an idea popular in the churches that I studied, namely that every Christian is a missionary. This is more than just discourse, in that all congregants are expected to play their part in the evangelization effort, something which underscores its expansionist drive and has been successful in allowing the movement to swell and extend deeper into largely secular Muslim territory, even if this advance has also proven to be rather fragile. The appeal of unrealized potential, of extending into the realms of darkness, was in fact intensified by the dangers of the unknown, producing high levels of conviction among foreign and local missionaries. To give you a sense of what this looked like, let's turn to my good acquaintance, Pastor Karajan, who was leading a church in Jalalabad, a region locally known to be more conservatively Muslim than the north of the country. In his church sermons and in my conversations with him, Karajan would speak energetically of the various evils he had encountered and that he had conquered through prayer and faith. Among these evils were the spirit of sorcery, the spirit of destruction, and the spirit of poverty. These were not just abstract evils, they could be detected everywhere. You could feel it, for example, in the shake of a hand, if the hand turned out to be cold, in illness or in domestic violence. And he saw it as his main task to combat these evils and to rescue people from the holds that mullahs and shamans, bakhshis, luckily, had held over these people. This required constant evangelization and prayer and had varying success, not least because the church's gospel of prosperity could not always deliver earthly success among congregants, and because the opposition by Muslim relatives and local communities could be formidable. While on the one hand, this opposition, this kind of produced a constitutive outside that contributed to a sense of purpose, it also set limitations to expansion. Let me quote Pastor Karajan to drive the message home. If you would add up all the people who converted in our church, you would probably get to 800 people, but only 200 of them were still considered members. What happens, he explained, is that the open people come to our church, but then relatives and others start to put pressure on this person. They try to convince them that they should not go to the church. They will offer money so that they won't go. And if that doesn't help, they will ostracize them. It's the usual thing. Persecution is part of Christianity. Pastor Karajan's church was a forward-pushing movement and could survive only by staying on the offensive. Numerous congregants had fallen by the wayside, but that was only to be expected because not everyone is chosen to be saved. In a sense, failure was part of the struggle between good and evil, and it was through this struggle that a fragile conviction could be maintained, at least in the short term. One of the challenges that evangelicals faced in Kyrgyzstan was in fact competition from the conservative piety movement Tablighi Jamaat. Even though they each had a somewhat different audience, in the evangelical churches Kyrgyz women were overrepresented among the Tablighis Kyrgyz men. By 2015, evangelical pastors told me that they had lost many members after the Tablighis started to become active in their villages and towns. The Tablighis had in a way predicted that when, as early as 2003, they told me, well, until now Christians have been more active in carrying out mission work, but this is now changing as we are getting involved in calling people closer to Islam. Missionization is at the heart of the Tablighi Jamaat, which originated in North India in the 1920s and developed its focus on the conversion of non-Muslims to Islam in reaction to European Christian missions. Its activities in Central Asia mostly focused on nominal Muslims, and moreover, it has its own theory and strategy of how such missionization should proceed. It focuses on practice rather than bookish knowledge, inviting people to follow the path of the Prophet. Importantly, it's highly regular in its approach. According to the method of Tabligh, its affiliates, or dawachis as they are locally called, should strive to devote one evening a week to dawat, literally invitation work. They should take part in 3-day dawats each month and a 40-day Dawat each year and go abroad on a 3-month Dawat once in a lifetime. In Kyrgyzstan, it was rare for Dawatchis to achieve and maintain perfect regularity, but the efforts to live up to this ideal had nevertheless produced an impressive forward-moving network. Significantly, the mission trips were not carried out by single individuals, as could be the case among evangelicals, but rather by well-structured groups of 6 to 12 men who together formed an insulated bubble, as it were, when they engaged in proselytizing. Moreover, its resilience was amplified by adopting the saying that, quote, the responsibility of the messenger ends with having communicated the message, something that allowed them to shrug off any negative responses they encountered. And there were many. Moreover, although they see themselves as facilitators of truth, the mission trips were also geared towards strengthening their own relationship with truth. For example, one of my acquaintances remarked at the end of a mission trip to a particularly destitute town where no one was interested in what they had to say, literally no one, that the rampant alcoholism, the immoral behavior, and the poverty he observed there had made him very aware of the emptiness and hopelessness of a life without God. The experience had spiritually invigorated him. This is not to say that the Tablighis don't care about expansionist success. Rather, they had a way of accepting its postponement. As one Dawatchi told me during another trip, even their mere presence would leave behind footprints and thereby prepare the ground for future missionary work. And when people who had been participants in Dawat stopped their active engagement, they were not considered to be lost. Rather, as one Tablighi put it, those who discontinued still have acquired some understanding of Islam and of our method. That will make society more open to us. This less antagonistic relationship, at least when compared to evangelical approaches, was palpable. In a way, what the Tablighis attended to was the underlying foundation, or the seabed in our metaphor, onto which the waves of missionization could roll in. And over the years, this is what has happened. The movement did not produce crashing waves, and it constantly needs to fight against the loss of energy. But until now, this has also produced rolling waves coming onto shore, as it were. Not especially spectacularly, but gaining significant ground in Kyrgyzstani society. So let's now shift to the Georgian Orthodox Church, moving back from Central Asia to the Caucasus and to the Church's mission work in Ajara. Some things are obviously different there. While the Tablighi Jamaat and evangelical Christians project a religious life and identity that transcends national and cultural distinctions, this was rather different for the Orthodox Church of Georgia. It's true, of course, that missionization across cultural boundaries has a long history in Orthodox Christianity too, but missionization in Ajara had a distinct national and cultural flavor and saw its work as bringing Ajarans back to their native religion. Although this national and cultural coloring can be explained by historical and political circumstances, it's also related to Orthodox Christian thought on missionization. As one archbishop put it, quote, Orthodox mission, internal or external, is through its nature ecclesiastic. No one is saved alone. No one offers Christ's salvation alone. And in the context of Georgia, this is reflected in efforts to integrate the entire national body as well as its territory into the Georgian Orthodox Church. This territorial, spatial dimension deserves some emphasis, which allows me to briefly return to the pilgrimage to Didachara mentioned at the beginning of my lecture. One of the things that stood out during this pilgrimage was its material dimension. For this pilgrimage, I had joined Bishop Dimitri in Batumi, traveling in his car to Upper Ajara, in what turned out to be a long journey, not just because of the road quality, but also because along the way we stopped at various places where we would bless, where houses were blessed, even a petrol station. Moreover, the icon of St. Andrew that accompanied us was taken out of the car repeatedly wherever we met people. One of the accompanying priests took time to explain that the locally oven-baked breads that featured two perpendicular cuts reflected the continuing relevance of an older Christian tradition, and so on. In short, we were also spiritually enriching the national landscape as we drove through it, working towards integrating it into Georgian Orthodox space. This material dimension has relevance in all the church's mission work in Adjara, I would suggest, but obviously we should also pay attention to its work with and among people. Father Miriani, the then priest in Hulo, emphasized that missionization was a gradual process and that conversion could only be the outcome of an extended period of learning. This was interesting to me, also because there had been several well-publicized mass baptism events, and Father Miriani himself had also baptized people who possibly did not have much knowledge of the religious tenets. Indeed, by the year 2000, the church in Hulo counted several hundred members, approximately 5% of the population, which was seen as a considerable success in a place that was the Islamic center of gravity in Upper Adjara. This growth posed its own problems, and indeed Father Miriani expressed concern that the expansion of his church was not necessarily accompanied with a deepening of Christian knowledge. Some new Christians seem more interested in the image of Georgian Orthodoxy than in its spiritual ideas or doctrinal knowledge. In conversion narratives, the Georgian nation figured particularly prominently, such as when an elderly male convert expressed his exaltation of finally having been baptized Georgian. Such notions were understandable, given that Islam had been associated with an Ottoman past, which had been vilified in official discourse since the beginnings of Soviet rule, while the link between the Georgian nation and Christian faith had become the bedrock of national ideology. The Church's stance on this issue was ambivalent. Father Miriani, for example, never hesitated to prompt the link between the Church and the nation, but simultaneously stressed the deep and uncorrupted spirituality of Orthodox Christianity. This ambivalence appeared to reflect a pragmatic approach. Perhaps these first converts did not convert for spiritual reasons, but in making the first step, they paved the way for their children to become true Christians. Given this longer-term perspective, it would be valuable if I could give you a sense of how things have progressed since the early 2000s. Unfortunately, though, very little has been published on this, and my new fieldwork in Upper Adjara will only start this summer. It might be... It's better. Right. Let me see where I am. It might be worthwhile, though, to descend to the coast, where over the past years I have done new field work in the border village of Sarpi. Here, conversion had already progressed quite far by the year 2000, with approximately half the population having been baptized, and with the process of conversion having continued apace since then. And naturally, the landscape has also changed. Nowadays, when arriving in Georgia through the Sarpi border crossing, it is hard to escape the impression that one is entering Christian land. An impressive church, which you see here, has been built on the coastline, and not far down the road one encounters a monument dedicated to St. Andrew. Looking up into the hills, one can see another church privately funded and unfinished, with a large metal cross in front that is illuminated at night. Less visible, but still relevant, is that a convent has been founded at the site of a medieval church into the hills. In short, we see a landscape that has been transformed, infused with religious constructions. But it's also fair to say that it now lacks the vibrancy and energy that is associated with missionization. The work is done, as it were, and what had been a religious frontier is now firmly integrated into a Christian landscape. And while almost all villagers in Sarpi now identify as Orthodox Christian, what also struck me is that actual church attendance is rather low. It kind of looks like the calm of high tide, perhaps even showing signs of retreat. I do expect a very different situation in Upper Adjara, not least because there has been quite a bit of Islamic renewal there too. If I decide to continue with my metaphor of the wave, it will be interesting to see what shape this has taken. Might be more choppy, but we'll have to find out. The point of this talk was not to convince anyone to adopt the term topological or morphological, terms that I agree can be off-putting, and whose more systematic applications have actually become quite unhelpful, too technical. Rather, I try to make an argument that was both more subtle and potentially more far-reaching. In short, what I'm suggesting is that we ignore forms at our peril, precisely because people imagine space through shapes, whether it's in the form of an imaginary free market, a pandemic landscape consisting of bubbles, or indeed the frontier to be conquered, tamed, and transformed. And these imaginations influence human action, as we have seen above. The frontier image betrayed a sense of superiority, of being the keepers of truth, which missionaries feel obliged to bring to those who live in darkness. But we also saw that there were important variations. In their aggressive push to bring the truth to the unreached, evangelicals had considerable short-term success. This was accompanied by confrontation and resulted in casualties, but that was the price to pay in their effort to defeat forces of evil. The Tablighis were in some ways similar, but they used routine and method as a means to revitalize a dormant Islam, meanwhile working towards societal acceptance that would facilitate future transformations. For Georgian Orthodox missions in Adjara, the ideas of continuity and integrity were central, something that could be achieved by reconfiguring the national religious time-space of Orthodox Christianity in the region. And as these missionaries acted out these imaginations, they filled space with sensory, material, and social texture. The imaginations and strategies of missionaries form just one part of the puzzle, though. The space in which missionaries operated was already pre-formed by history, by competing religious traditions, by political relations, and economic realities. All this converged in actual encounters, ones that were sometimes confounding, but whose figurations betrayed the histories, imaginations, and expectations of the involved. We saw, for example, how knowledgeable priests interacted with supplicant followers and mischievous villagers. And because these interactions endured over time, as Norbert Elias would put it, beyond interaction is interdependency, they formed figurations that gained a semi-autonomous dynamic and direction. In this lecture, it was not any concrete form or figure that I wish to impress on you, and hence I don't feel particularly committed to the metaphor of the wave. For me, it was a useful tool, one that is sufficiently fluid to visualize the variation that may exist within one broader form. Moreover, the inherently unstable characteristics of waves allowed me for thinking about how imaginations and actualities interlock dynamically to produce transformations of space. But even if useful, it's still merely a tool. Other metaphors might be similarly useful. Instead of ending with a firm conclusion on waves or on frontiers, let me instead offer a last reflection, a somewhat personal one. When 20 years I published my first book, Defending the Border, which focused on Adjara, it featured a back cover endorsement by Georgi Darlugian, who used the opportunity to level a critique at the then best-selling work by Thomas Friedman, titled The World is Flat, in the sense that Friedman thought ideological differences no longer mattered all that much. For Darlugian, my book exemplified that the world, even with open borders, is anything but flat. I happily agreed, of course, but it's also fair to say that his comment has haunted me ever since. How do we combat spatial flatness? Not just empirically, as I had done in that book, but also analytically. Yes, we do so by paying attention to the multiple dimensions and registers through which space is constructed. But we should also do so, I suggest, by identifying and theorizing the contours, configurations, forms, and shapes that characterize space. In this lecture, I attempted to make a modest contribution to do just that. So with that, I end, and thank you.